Hi, I'm Jeff Forster. I'm the Department Head of Ceramics at the Glassell School of Art and a former resident artist at the Craft Center here back in 2009 and 10. And I currently have pieces in the Nothing Goes to Waste exhibition. And today I'm going to talk just a little bit about my process in making those pieces. So the first thing I'm going to say is the processes in my creative process vary dramatically. I'm not really tied to any one process, and I press mold the slabs, I build slabs, a wheel throw element sometimes, I build solid things. I would say if there's any one constant, it's that there's always some element of recycling. That's part of the process. Probably the most commonly used is press molds and sort of cast off or found objects. A lot of times that's styrofoam packing materials, but I've used anything from old planters to koi ponds and other things I find in people's big trash piles or elsewhere. The probably most relevant pieces in this show that follow a similar process are what I call the Glaze Scape series. So there's a Glaze Scape conglomerate and the igneous Glaze Scape. So those are actually press molded in an old bisqueware mold that actually made to make plates for a commission at one point. And you can see the mold is broken. I actually like that about it, because you pick up that sort of flaw in the idea that that's a repurposed, I guess, piece of studio furniture that I'm reusing. And so what I do there is fill that with a studio reclaim. And we have, I think, 12 barrels now of clay waste at Glassell, and all different sort of firing temperatures and colors, and I'm just packing that clay into this mold to essentially create vessels to contain glaze waste. Some of the other pieces in the show, like the glazed waste recyclers, glazed waste depository, there's a flux fissure hanging on the wall. Those are actually vessels that I appropriated, or were given to me rather, by students. So some of they're basically all deemed as trash, cracked, or otherwise got too hard before they were finished, and they were going to the waste barrel. And so with most of those, what I do is just leave them on the glaze counter in the studio, and then any glaze waste that's produced can be deposited directly into those vessels. And you can see some of them actually, from the tension of the glaze moving in the firing process, crack apart during the firing. So it's always a balance of trying to contain that sort of, or avoid a mess essentially. And there's a lot of steps I take to do that, including like under firing glazes so they're not running everywhere. The other way that I accumulate glaze waste is just with a barrel or a bucket that I keep in the glaze lab. And so if there's not a vessel on the counter, that's always a go-to to collect waste and glaze. And often what I do with that is just use it like a thick sludge to sort of finger paint with, or even just kind of pack it in a really thick sort of layer. Like the flux fissure is like, I think 4 inches of glaze sludge essentially. And so the depth in those, I think, is partly what causes those glazes to sort of crack and peel apart and create the fissures that I'm so drawn to. So I guess the glaze collecting I should talk about briefly, like how that all started. I was actually a resident artist at an art center in Florida, the Armory Art Center, and as one of my tech responsibilities, I made basic slab containers to contain the glaze waste, and we fired that, and it was at that point that I learned, or actually thought of, the fact that all those heavy metals before they're fired are actually toxic for the environment. And so to put the raw glaze directly into the environment is actually an environmental hazard. And so by firing the glaze before discarding it, you're actually making it safer for the environment or pollution. And so in the process of doing that, I just thought, wow, there's all this great material I could actually do something creative with. And it took me several years to actually start to implement it in ways into my creative process. But now it's an ongoing process where I'm always collecting and thinking about creative ways to use that waste. in all of these processes, I don't know for sure what the glaze is going to be. So there's always like an element of chance in my work, or risk, I guess, and I actually really enjoy that happy accident or the surprise I get once I fire these things and see what I have. And then a lot of times I have to come back and address that to, I guess, make it more visually appealing to me. I don't always like it initially after the first firing. And so I usually come back and thinking about color theory and my background as a painter and trying to make it a more aesthetically pleasing composition. And some of the pieces, I'm thinking of the Glaze Scape Conglomerate. There's actually like a full block of clay, and you can sort of see the, I guess, the hint of the container that solidified in, the pint that the glaze dried in. And sometimes I like to keep that shape intact by underfiring it. And to me, that sort of reinforces that idea of this is a recycled glaze instead of a glaze that maybe I made up and just used in an unorthodox fashion. I think that relates to another body of work I do, my Scholar Stone series. And basically what that is in a Scholar Stone, a person would go into the wilderness and spend sometimes weeks looking for just the right natural object that often sort of referenced like a sacred space. Mount Fuji was very common. And then they would build an elaborate stand for it. And so sort of in that same train of thinking, I sometimes will just pull things out of the reclaim barrel when I'm looking in that have some aesthetic value to me. They have inherent qualities in them that I find beautiful. And I'll just take and then fire those objects, and then into all the pieces, when I have just a blank sort of bisqueware object, that becomes a canvas for me to address. And the same can be true for the object solidification series. So look, those, just like the glaze I talked about, reference the containers they solidified in, but then talking about the sort of painterly approach, I then have this like blank bisqueware canvas that I often treat like a canvas. And so there's Mark Rothko is probably one of my more favorite painters. And so his sort of sensibilities seep into my pieces quite often. And you can see some complementary color schemes and analogous color schemes and those things that show up in my work. One of my allures to ceramics is that the materials come from the earth and they're very geologic in nature. And then in the kiln, you're really speeding up geologic processes. And so from an environmental standpoint, that's interesting to me. And then trying to preserve the environment by firing this glaze waste and collecting other cast-off materials and using those in my creative research, I think all goes hand in hand and sort of, revering, I guess, the natural environment and protecting that for future generations. Thanks for listening. Again, I'm Jeff Forster. If you've not seen the Nothing Goes to Waste exhibition, I hope that you can come by and do that to see some of my new pieces and work of a lot of other artists that I admire.